welcome to the Ellis Talker Show. Today I have a very special guest, Mr. Marcus Brotherton. How you doing, sir?
Great to be here. Thanks.
Mr. Marcus Brotherton has written many books on from Band of Brothers to to Joe Johnson and his experience. He writes about veterans and he puts God into it. And I really wanted to have him on. So thank you so much for coming on, sir.
Great to be here.
So I would like for if you could tell the audience just a little bit about you, and then we'll kind of get into all the other stuff.
Yeah, so I write a lot of military nonfiction. I write the occasional novel as well, usually based on true stories. But I seek to shine the spotlight on the military almost solely in my work, although not quite solely. But I've had a fantastic opportunity over the last 20 years plus to interview a lot of veterans and military personnel, and so it's just been great. Yeah, I try and really shine the spotlight on them.
What would you say drew you to that subject? Because you could have wrote about anything, and I saw some of your earlier books. And what drew you to this particular subject?
It's a funny story, really, because I grew up in Canada, and so the military up there does a great job. It's kind of a different system than writing about the American military. And I came across the line for university and grad school, married an American. I've stayed down here ever since. So I was working in the field of journalism, first as a newspaper reporter and then into books. And I really stumbled into this subject. It's been just a fantastic education for me as much as anything. My agent knew Don Malarkey and Buck Compton, two of the original Band of Brothers. And Buck lived up in my area, and he was writing his memoirs. This was back in '05, '06. And my agent said, "Hey, would you be interested in working with Lieutenant Compton?" I mean, what an amazing question there. And I jumped at the chance. And then it was just a process of really getting up to speed as quickly as I could. Buck proved to be a fantastic teacher, as well as writer and thinker. And we worked on his book, and that kind of set everything in motion from there.
And wow, and that I can't, that's for me. That's something because I watched Band of Brothers, and I'm sure some of the audience has as well. And Buck Compton's story throughout and what he went through, and a lot of my brothers and sisters in arms can understand, how that went and how that progressed along. Why do you think this particular subject resonates so much with people?
Yeah, I've in my own writing, I've never. There's some writers who want to write about, I guess, really intricate details about the specifics of battles and sort of, this movement went here and this flanked there. I appreciate that. For me, it always comes down to the humanity of the person. You take really ordinary people and you put them into these extraordinary circumstances, and then how do these people respond? And it prompts the question, wow, what would I do if I was there? I think it also prompts gratitude as we study the lives of these people who really did took heroic measures in so many ways. We want to go, wow, who do I thank? So much of my life has been given to me because of what um, these people have done for me. They have made my life secure in so many ways. They have made my life. They have given me opportunity, and so there's a huge piece of gratitude that when we study these people, this gratitude can flow out of us.
Dealing with these different veterans, what is that common theme that you see within them when you're looking to write in something and it's inspiring you? What differences have you seen with these generations?
The I would say the character trait of humility comes out just loud and clear, which is strange because you have these people who are doing really heroic things, and yet when I interview these people and I say, hey, do you consider yourselves a hero? I mean, every person to a man says, absolutely not. I'm just doing my job. And that's remarkable.
Yeah, and it's for me it's that is something that I've never been comfortable with. When somebody says, "Hey," they say, "Thank you for your service." I'm grateful because my dad as a Vietnam vet didn't get that, but it I wasn't a hero. I think I consider those guys World War II heroes. They saved the world. The world would be a very different place if it wasn't for them.
Hmm.
But I found that they are um, very humble people. Now, when you want to go into these books, um, kind of how is your approach and getting extensively into the history without because you have to tell a story. So how do you keep from violating the history of the story while making it, interesting and readable.
The history's got to be there. I do fact check everything. I work with at least one, if not two, research assistants who get into the nuts and bolts of every book I do. So the accuracy is there. Do I make mistakes? Oh yeah. I mean, it's as much as we try and check and double check and triple check everything. Every book, there's one or two things where I go, oh, okay, next edition we'll have to change that. But I've worked with any number of veterans who've been alive, and of course, the interviews are very key there. And then I've worked with several veterans who've been deceased, and I've worked with their estates and their families. And so at points like that, uh, has he left a manuscript? Has he left a journal? Has he done interviews? I'm interviewing his family and friends. I'm interviewing his fellow veterans who fought along with them. So it's sort of every and any angle that I can get to get that story and get the as complete a picture as I can of the man.
And I wanted to put up some of the books that you have written. Um, Out of these, and you think about this, you wrote Shifty's War and these Voices of the Pacific, and because Europe got covered a lot, the Pacific was a different story, and you covered all of these. Which one of these stories affected you the most? Which one had the most profound effect on you?
Mm. It's probably each story as I'm working on it. I think it takes me to a new level, a new depth. Um, the the band of brothers, I was able to meet so many of them in person. Um, a number of them became, I would even say, friends, although I use that term carefully. Buck Compton definitely became a friend. He lived 45 minutes from my house. After his book came out, we traveled together. He was still speaking. He was in his late 80s, and he was still speaking nationally by then. So his daughter phoned me up one day and just said, my dad could kind of use a traveling companion just to help him navigate airports and whatnot. So I ended up taking a number of trips with Buck, just sort of all over the country, and he had a remarkable memory. And sometimes he'd just be sitting in an airport lounge somewhere, and he would be telling me stories from his childhood just so clearly. Those were some of the most special and fun times, really, with him.
And that Bug Compton story, I can't wait to actually read that book. That's next. I'm reading the Bright and Blinding Sun story with Joe Johnson, and I want to get into that in a little bit. But in Company of Heroes, you talk about Easy Company. Is there something that, as you started studying and getting into that story, is there something that kind of surprised you or completely unexpected that you learned?
So the book of Company of Heroes was done with the families of the deceased men in Easy Company. I had met a number of these families at air shows and association meetings over the years, and there was a number of stories that hadn't been featured in the miniseries. And these adult age children were saying, my dad, he passed away 10 years ago or whatever, but wow, what a story he's got. So I was able to interview, I think it was 20 or 23 of these families and tell them of the stories. In that book, I would say your question was there a kind of a surprising aspect of that book? We included, I would say, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in the sense that some of the stories that the families had were not sort of rose colored. They were more, my dad came home from the war and wow, he really struggled. And the drug of choice for that generation was alcohol, and wow, my dad really struggled with alcohol. And here was the result of that. It was the story of what combat can do to a person, to a man, to a young man, and how he comes home from war and he's trying to pick up with his life and struggling to hold a job, struggling with anger, struggling with depression and nightmares. And so a number of these stories were difficult to tell, difficult to wade into. And yet I think there is an overall power in that book. It is a more complete picture, I think, of the after effects of this horrific phenomenon that we call war.
And it is horrific. One of the things that I like to say is I never want to hurt another person ever in my life.
Yeah.
It never, ever, ever I want to hurt another person. I'd rather live my life in peace. I don't want my son to go to war. Don't get me wrong. I would pick up my rifle for my country in a heartbeat, but I don't want to ever again. It's just one of those things that I'm sure a lot of other vets feel that way. And
Mhm.
PTSD, I love that you tell the story because sometimes war can get romanticized. It could get it, and then the ugly part of it coming back and telling that story. I'm sure that I love that you cover that, that you look at that, because that could be the ugly part that a lot of people don't talk about. And
Right.
you like to draw, or you like to, in your stories, you like to look at lesser known stories, like, this Shifty's War, and how do you go about, like, what draws you to these overlooked stories?
Shifty's War was a great book and a great subject matter. I had interviewed Shifty probably half a dozen times in person. He had cancer at the end. He was frail. He had his good days and his bad days for sure. And he passed away from cancer before his book was completed. But I was able to touch base with him in person. Shifty Powers, fascinating guy because he was such a basic guy. Here was this soft-spoken, sort of old hillbilly in the holler. That's the term that he used about himself. He was a soft-spoken machinist from Clinchco, Virginia, this small, tiny coal mining town in the Hicks, as he would say. And so he didn't necessarily lead a remarkable life in many ways when he came home from the war. I mean, he was one of the band of brothers. He did remarkable things in the war. He was the sharpshooter for the company. He was depended upon sort of time and time again to get that critical shot and save people by doing so. When he came home from the war, he was just a family man. I mean, he married, he had kids, he coached baseball, and yet people around the world know the name of Shifty Powers, and that was fascinating to me. What was so important about Shifty that the world knew his name? And I think his life is really a testament to doing the right thing, to picking up with your life and keep going forward and being faithful and devoted and committed day in and day out, and kind of living this quiet life of purpose and helping others. And in some ways, his ordinary life turned very, very extraordinary.
These stories, you get the origins of all of this, and you talk about it in your books. And so, does that ever kind of surprise you that that was the origin, and this is where that person ended, that journey?
I had done a few books on Easy Company by the time I came to Shifty Power's story, and in my mind, I was saying, I think I'm probably done with Band of Brothers. I don't want to sort of oversaturate myself in the subject, even though it's a fascinating subject. And his son phoned me up, Wayne Powers, and he said, "My sister and I have been talking. We really like your books. We like your work. Would you consider doing a book about her father?" And I was like, "Wow, I really got to think about that." So I talked to my agent about it, and it's kind of funny story here. So my agent is, and he's a nuts and bolts guy. I mean, he is all about business and very kind of a cut and dry guy. He's not given to emotion or sort of uh, extra worldly things. Um, so we were both kind of mulling this for a couple of days, and then my agent calls me up pretty early in the morning. He said, "Marcus, you'll never guess what." He said, "Last night I had this dream where I saw a book about Shifty Powers just take shape and come to fruition." He's like, "You absolutely have to do this book." So I don't know what was happening there in the cosmos. I'm a man of faith. Sometimes signs and wonders happen in the world, and we have to live by mystery. But that was one of the big reasons about why I did that book. I definitely loved the subject matter. It was a worthy story to tell. And then my agent, this businessman, had a dream. So
Yeah.
that's how it all went down.
Well, the thing is that, with your extraordinary work, you still got to pay the bills, and
That's right. That's
those
right.
kind of things. Unfortunately, that's part of putting art out into the world. There's sticks, there are expenses to that. But it's funny how God puts you in those situations, and steers you, and you're unable to see the big picture till later, and then
Right.
you're like,
Right.
that's why that happened.
Yeah.
So you also wrote Blaze of Light. What drew you to that story? And can you tell me?
Yeah. Yeah, Gary Bykirk actually is his name. Gary is a fascinating man. So he was a Green Beret medic in Vietnam. People tend to think of Vietnam as a hazy war. It was not as black and white perhaps as World War II, even though in some ways that's debatable. Gary's story was more black and white, even though he fought in Vietnam. He was a medic in this tiny village in Dak Sang, right near the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and he was tasked with being the lead medical officer to 12 Green Berets in the camp, and 2,400 indigenous fighters and their families. So this was men, women, and children in this tiny little camp, and all went well for the first year that he was there. It was really an idyllic time. He was helping everybody uh, in the company. He was delivering babies. He was filling teeth. I mean, he was really sort of chief cook and bottle washer when it came to medicine in the camp, and making friends with everybody. They loved him. This is an indigenous tribe in the Highlands region. He became a an official member of their tribe, and they just loved him. And all that changed early in the spring, one morning, 1970. Literally 10,000 enemy soldiers had surrounded this tiny village at night, and they began to just shell the village without mercy. So Gary is responsible for patching people up, for helping people, and it's a bloodbath in there. It was just horrific. But as Gary is running around the battlefield, and this is again men, women, and children who are dying, Gary himself gets hit 3 times, chest, back, hip, and he's paralyzed from the waist down. I mean, he's laying flat on the battlefield. He can't walk. He can't move his legs, and his war is over. He's bleeding out. But here's the amazing thing about his story. While he's lying there, so many people have just given up. He's like, you know what? I still have a job to do. And so he calls 2 helpers to his side and he says, carry me. And so they prop him up and they begin to drag him around the battlefield from one wounded person to another. So Gary, this chief medic, can still continue rendering aid to these wounded people. Fascinating story. So Gary does heal up after the war. He does regain the use of his legs. Met him in person. We had him over at our house. He met my children. Just a phenomenal man. Yeah, a great project.
Thank you for telling that story. I love that. That's just, and you look back at all, like a lot of the Medal of Honor winners, and they, I mean, it is extraordinary if they lived. I mean, most of them died. If they live, it is extraordinary their actions and bravery. It's it's wow. So um, the bright the bright and burning light, or sun, I'm sorry, bright and burning sun, and I'm sorry about that. I've been dealing with that title.
It's
um
a hard title to
mhm,
remember. Yeah, A Bright
yeah,
and Blinding Sun.
mhm.
It's after my agent really loved the title of this book, and after it came out, we've had a number of people kind of go, "What is the title of that book?" A Bright and Blinding Sun. So I think I'm just going to name my books from here on out just one word. You know,
Yeah, I'm sorry. A bright and burning sun. One of the things with PTSD is memory, and I definitely deal with the memory thing.
all
But
good.
so I was reading, I was listening to that book, Marcus, and it was just wow. So this kid Joe Johnson, he grows up in a depression. His dad, like a lot of dads at the time, couldn't make it, so he ran out on him. You had the mom, she found happiness in a one-legged dude, and this guy's journey is just amazing, like what he went through, and it started like at 12. This kid is just, you realize the our kids now, and I don't know the age of your kids, and my kids are a little older, but when they were young at 12, they, you know I was a little more advanced because I was in New York City, but they at 12 years old, they couldn't do the things that Joe Johnson did. But the story keeps getting just wow, wow, wow as it keeps going. So I wanted you to kind of talk about that book, and then we'll go into the new book and wrap up.
Yeah, Joe Johnson, true story. He runs away from his mother's house at age 12 in Memphis to escape this difficult home life. Runs to his father's house, stays in Texas, lives there 2 years. They eventually move to California, and then things don't work out at his father's house either. And so Joe is kind of given this ultimatum: okay, you can go back to your mother's, or you can probably live at your grandmother's. Probably she'll have you, but you got to get out of here, says his dad. And so Joe, just kind of in a fit of anger because it's a difficult conversation, he goes, "Well, fine, maybe I'll just run away and join the army." Now, this is a bluff. I mean, he's only 14 years old at the time, but Joe goes to bed that night and he begins to think about things. And he's like, well, in the army, I'll be eating 3 times a day. I'm a hard worker. Why not? And this is before Pearl Harbor, right? Just before Pearl Harbor. So, and Joe is, he's a kid. He's not necessarily aware of world events at his age. That morning he steals out of his house very early, finds a recruiter's office that's open in Pasadena, swears on a stack of Bibles that his birth certificate is lost. But yeah, oh yeah, he's 18, and gets lost in the shuffle. So this kid manages to join the military, and he's only 14 years old. Very soon he is shipped to the Philippines, and whammo, Pearl Harbor hits. The Philippines are attacked 10 hours later, and this kid, this teenager, is thrust into this horrific battle, and he's got to fight his way out. The troops on the Philippines, you probably know the history here. They fight that spring until late that spring, until General Wainwright has no choice really but to surrender all of the troops. And so Joe finds himself a prisoner of war of Imperial Japan, and times are hard. Times are hard.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I don't want to give away the whole book. Please, go out and get it. But it's just extraordinary. And how do you? And I know that your faith is important. You weave faith into that book. Can you talk about like how how your faith incorporates into the stories and the things you've seen with these other veterans come to faith?
Yeah, people always say don't ever talk about religion or politics. It's funny because when you start asking people questions about religion or politics, everybody wants to talk about it. And so I always ask any veteran that I've interviewed, tell me some of your deeper beliefs. And eh, particularly when it comes to faith, and particularly when a man is older, I think everybody that I've ever talked to has got some answer to the big questions of life. Why are we here? Where did we come from? Where are we going when we die? What's the purpose of all this? And so Joe Johnson in that book, A Bright and Blinding Sun, fascinating story there because he was not a man of faith through most of his life. And yet when he was thrust into battle, yeah, he began to pray. When he was in the prison of war camps, yeah, he was doing some heavy praying there. But it wasn't really until after the war and many years had passed, he had PTSD quite severely, did a lot of work, ended up in a mental health unit at one point, and where he really was challenged to forgive the enemy, and set his life in ease there. So at age 90, and you got to picture this, at age 90, he is sitting at home one day watching TV, just flipping channels, and he comes across this the TV ministry of Dr. Charles Stanley, who's a famous preacher in the Atlanta area, and Dr. Stanley is saying, hey, have you ever turned your life over to Christ? And Joe's like, I don't think I've ever done that ever. And so right then and there, in the privacy of his own home, at that 11th hour, Joe kneels on the carpet and undergoes this conversion experience. And those who knew Joe best say, yeah, his life did change. Even then, he became a much calmer person and a much more hopeful person. 1 year later, Joe passed away. So it was really an 11th hour decision.
Wow. And 90, he kind of waited a while, but he got there. So y- kind of the new book that you're coming out, the long march home. I wanted you to kind of talk about it. Is it going to follow kind of like your other books? What is that story about?
It's a story about the Bataan Death March and three soldiers from the South who go over there and they make this vow that they're all going to come home alive, and then they're thrust into some pretty horrific circumstances in trying to keep that vow to each other and uphold their friendship. It's a book I did in conjunction with Tosca Lee, who's just a fantastic author, and it was great to kind of bring both of our minds and both of our voices to the table and to the page. That book, it was a back burner project. It was unfunded at the start, and so we just worked on it in little pieces here and there. We actually worked on that book for 12 years, and finally it came to the place where we took it from good to great, and it just received a starred review in Publishers Weekly, which is extremely difficult to get. So it's there's a lot of buzz already about this book, and I think readers are going to love it. So
And when does it come out?
it comes out this May. Yeah, you can pre-order right now. It's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and all the sites. So
I will do that. And are you going to be having signed copies by chance?
hopefully so. Yeah, we're still talking to the publisher about that, so we'll get some at least book plates out. So yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm very thankful that you allowed me to allowed me on this interview and gave me your time. It's valuable, and I do appreciate it. And I want you to know that I love that you tell the stories of my brothers and sisters so beautifully, and connect so powerfully, and you do it with an angle of honoring God and honoring them. And thank you so much for doing that.
All right, thank you.
So this I hope you guys enjoyed the interview. I'm going to be having some of the local folks that are running for office on here soon, so I hope you will watch those shows. Mr. Brotherton, thank you again for coming. Can you stick around when I close out?
Absolutely.
Thank you.